What happens when a place is created not to just imprison people, but to completely erase them? Hidden in the hills of Austria, one small city was the place for one of the most brutal Nazi concentration camps ever built. A place where death was not just inevitable, it was a part of the design. This is the story of the most brutal Nazi camp you've never heard of. This is the story of Mauthausen. To understand how this nightmare began, we must go back to 1938, the year Austria disappeared from the map. On March 12, 1938, German troops rolled into Austria in a swift and bloodless invasion. Within a single day, Austria ceased to exist. The Nazis called it the Anschluss, the union of Austria and Germany. But in reality, it was an annexation, one that marked the beginning of Hitler's expansionist dreams. Austria was now under Nazi control, and with it came a terrifying shift. Almost overnight, political enemies, Jews, and anyone seen as a threat to Nazi rule were rounded up and thrown into prison. But for the Nazis, imprisonment wasn't enough. They wanted something bigger, something that would not only punish their enemies, but profit from their suffering. And so they looked to a small town in northern Austria, Mauthausen. But why Mauthausen? The answer was simple: because of the stone. Mauthausen sat next to a massive granite quarry, a seemingly endless supply of rock that had been used for centuries. But to the Nazis, this wasn't just any quarry, it was the foundation for the future of the Third Reich. Hitler had grand architectural visions: massive buildings, towering monuments, and vast highways, all designed to showcase the power of Nazi Germany. These plans required tons of stone, and Mauthausen had more than enough to fuel this ambition. But stone alone wasn't enough. The Nazis needed workers, thousands of them, and they had no intention of hiring laborers. They would build their empire on the backs of slaves. So, on August 8, 1938, just 5 months after Austria's annexation, the first prisoners arrived in Mauthausen. They came from Dachau, Germany's first concentration camp. Their mission was to build their own prison. These early prisoners laid the first bricks of what would become one of the most feared Nazi camps in history. They built barbed wire fences, barracks, and watchtowers, all while under the watchful eye of SS guards. With every stone they placed, they were unknowingly constructing their own death sentence. But Mauthausen wasn't just another prison. It was something far more sinister. Unlike other camps, Mauthausen was classified as Category 3. This was the highest, most brutal category in the Nazi system, a place for incorrigible political enemies who were never meant to leave. It was quite literally the camp of no return. As the Nazis tightened their grip on Europe, Mauthausen grew. What started as a single camp soon expanded into a vast network. Over the next few years, more than 49 subcamps were established across Austria and southern Germany. These camps were factories of suffering, each designed to serve the Nazi war machine. Prisoners were sent to different subcamps based on their usefulness. Some were assigned to munitions factories, where they worked under inhumane conditions, producing weapons for the Nazi army. Others were sent to build railways and roads, working from sunrise to sunset with barely enough food to survive. And there was always another trainful of prisoners ready to take their place. As the war raged on, the number of prisoners grew. By 1945, Mauthausen and its subcamps held over 190,000 people, men, women, and even children. Some would live for months, some would last only days. But no matter how long they survived, they all shared the same fate. They were never meant to leave. Mauthausen had become a monstrous machine, grinding humans into nothing but ash and stone. But how did the Nazis push prisoners beyond human limits? How did they turn forced labor into a slow, systematic form of execution? To understand that, we must step inside the camp and witness the horrors waiting within its walls. Imagine stepping out of a train. your legs barely holding you up after days without food or water. You don't know where you are. All you see is a massive stone fortress surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers with machine guns aimed at the tracks. You're not alone. Hundreds of others are packed around you. Men, women, and even children. Some have already collapsed. The train doors slam shut behind you. There's no going back. You have just arrived at Mauthausen. If this sounds horrifying now, imagine what it was really like for those people. The moment prisoners stepped off the cattle cars, the process of erasing their identity began. SS guards with snarling dogs barked orders in German, striking anyone who moved too slowly. Confusion turned to panic as the prisoners were forced into a long line, their fate entirely in the hands of their captors. First was the registration process. Prisoners were ordered to strip completely naked, right there in front of everyone. Clothes, shoes, even family photos, everything was taken away. There was no exception. The lucky ones had their heads shaved immediately, others had to wait for days, their hair crawling with lice as they huddled together for warmth in the cold night air. Then came the number. A clerk at a wooden desk barely looked up as he stamped a serial number on a prisoner's arm. No names, no personal history. From that moment on, they were nothing but a number. If they were lucky, they were handed a filthy striped uniform, often taken from a dead inmate. If they weren't lucky, they got rags, sometimes just a thin shirt, no shoes, and nothing to protect them from the freezing Austrian winters. Once processed, prisoners were sent to the barracks, long wooden buildings meant to hold 300 people. But at Mauthausen, there were no rules. The Nazis stuffed up to 2,000 people into a single barrack. The moment they entered, the stench of sweat, rot, and unwashed bodies hit them like a wall. There were no beds, only wooden planks stacked in rows. They were expected to sleep sitting up or lying sideways like sardines, squeezed together so tightly that they could hardly breathe. If someone needed to use the bathroom, too bad. There were only a handful of filthy latrines overflowing with waste. Disease spread like wildfire. Tuberculosis, dysentery, typhus. There were no medicine and no doctors. The sick were left to rot next to the living, their groans mixing with the sound of rats scurrying in the dark. At night, the cold was unbearable. Prisoners clung to each other for warmth, and if someone was caught moving, a guard might beat them for disturbing the others. And yet, the real suffering had barely begun. If Mauthausen was designed to kill people slowly, starvation was one of its most effective weapons. Prisoners were given one meal a day, if it could be even called that. In 1945, when food supplies were running low, rations dropped to 600 calories per day. That was less than what a child needed to survive. Breakfast was a watery bowl of coffee, a tasteless burnt liquid with no actual coffee in it. Lunch was a thin soup made of rotten vegetables or potato peels, served in a bowl that had never been washed. Sometimes it was just hot water. Dinner was a small piece of black bread, hard as a rock, sometimes mixed with sawdust to make it last longer. If they were lucky, it came with a spoonful of margarine or mouldy cheese. But there was never enough. Prisoners fought over crumbs, licked their bowls clean, or dug through the trash for potato skins. Some chewed on leather straps or grass just to have something in their stomachs. The weaker they got, the closer they were to death. Starvation didn't just kill, it turned prisoners against each other. Friendships dissolved, people stole from one another. Those who had an extra crust of bread became targets, and if someone was caught hiding food, the SS guards would beat them to death, sometimes making the other prisoners watch as a warning. But the real terror wasn't hunger, it was who controlled the food. The SS controlled everything, but they weren't the one the prisoners had to fear most. The capos, or prisoner overseers, were other inmates chosen to keep order. Some were criminals, some were political prisoners, but most were willing to do anything to stay alive. They were given extra food, better sleeping conditions, and most importantly, power over other prisoners, and they abused it mercilessly. They decided who got more soup and who starved. They could beat, kill, or spare prisoners at will. Some were as cruel as the SS, using their whips and sticks to show their loyalty to their Nazi captors. And if a prisoner fought back, there was no mercy. The SS would line up the entire barrack and force them to watch as the prisoner was beaten until their bones shattered or hanged from an iron beam, their body left swinging as a warning. There was no escape from Mauthausen, no food, no warmth, no comfort, only pain, fear, and the slow, brutal march towards death. But for those forced to carry heavy stones up the stairs of death, the suffering was even worse. This was a towering stone staircase, 186 steps high, leading from the quarry to the camp above. But these weren't ordinary steps. They were uneven, jagged, and unstable, carved roughly into the earth. Some were half a metre high, others so worn down by footsteps that they became treacherous slopes. The quarry was Mauthausen's most feared work assignment. From sunrise to sunset, prisoners hacked at the stone, their bodies broken from the brutal labour. The goal wasn't just to extract granite, it was to crush the workers themselves. Once they had chiselled out the enormous slabs of rock, their task wasn't over. They had to carry them. One by one, the prisoners hoisted the stones onto their back, some so heavy that they could barely stand. Then the SS guards barked the order. They had to climb every 186 steps. Step by agonizing step, they had to drag their shattered bodies up the staircase. Some prisoners tried to pace themselves, moving slowly to conserve their strength, but there was no mercy here. All they could hear was faster, move, run. The SS guards screamed at them, whipped them, kicked them, striking anyone who dared to slow down. If a prisoner collapsed, they didn't get help. They got a boot to their ribs or a rifle butt to the skull. For many, there was no way to survive the climb. They staggered, slipped, and fell. And at Mauthausen, falling meant death. The staircase was packed tight with prisoners, each one carrying a massive stone on their shoulders. If someone lost their balance, if their legs finally gave out, it triggered a domino effect. They would collapse backward, crashing into the person behind them. The prisoner would fall into the one behind him, and in seconds, a cascade of bodies and stone blocks would come tumbling down the steps. The sound was horrific. The thud of bodies hitting stone, the cracks of breaking bones, the screams of men crushed under the weight of granite. The SS guards didn't care. In fact, they enjoyed it. They stood at the top, laughing as prisoners collapsed. Some would shoot them for sport, treating the staircase like a shooting gallery. Others would force survivors to carry their stones back up, even if their legs were broken, even if they were bleeding to death. But some punishments were even worse. At the top of the staircase, on the edge of the quarry, there was a sheer drop, a 50-metre cliff of jagged rock. The SS had a name for it, the parachutist's wall. It was one of the cruelest games ever devised. Prisoners who were too weak to work, those who had collapsed too many times, those who had lost too much weight, and those who the guards simply didn't like were singled out. They were led to the edge of the cliff. Then the SS guards gave a simple order: jump. If the prisoner hesitated, they were beaten until they were unconscious and then thrown off the cliff anyway. But sometimes the guards wanted entertainment. They wouldn't just push the prisoners themselves, they would force other inmates to do it. A prisoner would be brought to the edge, terrified, shaking, pleading for mercy. And then another prisoner would be dragged beside him, and of course, if they refused, they were beaten and thrown off also. If they obeyed, they would have killed an innocent man, but they lived another day. Many prisoners broke down in sobs, unable to do it. Some collapsed to their knees, begging for a different fate. But at Mauthausen, begging meant nothing. So the SS made a new rule. If you refused to push the man in front of you, you weren't just killed, you were pushed off together. The sounds of bodies hitting the rocks below was an everyday occurrence. The prisoners knew what was happening, but they just couldn't stop it. But even those who survived the quarry, the stairs of death, and parachute jump, Mauthausen had more horrors waiting. If a prisoner was too weak to work, if they collapsed too many times, if the guards simply didn't like the way they looked, they wouldn't wait for hunger or disease to take them. Instead, they would be killed on the spot, in some of the most horrifying ways imaginable. Most people associate gas chambers with extermination camps like Auschwitz, but Mauthausen had one too. It was small, hidden, and deadly efficient. Unlike in other camps where gas chambers were designed for mass extermination, Mauthausen's gas chamber was built to quietly dispose of those who could no longer work. It was located in the basement, deep inside the camp, are placed prisoners never returned from. The process was disturbingly simple. A group of prisoners, usually dozens at a time, were led inside. The SS guards told them that they were going to take a shower. Some believed it, others already knew the truth. The doors slammed shut, and then Zyklon B was dropped in. Within minutes, the prisoners collapsed, clawing at their throats as their lungs burned from the inside out. Some tried to scream, but the gas destroyed their ability to breathe. When it was over, the SS would drag out the bodies, scrape them clean, and prepare the room for the next group. Over 3,400 people died in this way. But not everyone was given a death so quickly. For thousands of prisoners, the gas chamber wasn't even necessary. Why waste expensive chemicals when a bullet could do the job just as well? At Mauthausen's execution site, prisoners were led out in groups of 10, 20, and 50 at a time. The location was a walled-off courtyard just beyond the camp's main square. Here, the SS lined prisoners up against a brick wall, their backs facing the soldiers. They weren't told what was happening. They didn't need to be. And then, without warning, the gunfire began. A line of bodies collapsed to the ground, one after the other. The SS laughed and smoked as they reloaded and prepared for the next group. Sometimes prisoners weren't executed standing up. Some were forced to kneel in front of a ditch, knowing that once the trigger was pulled, their bodies would fall into the pit like garbage. And the worst part, if the soldiers ran out of ammunition, they didn't stop the executions. They simply switched to knives, shovels, or their bare hands. For some prisoners, even a bullet was too quick. In one part of the camp, there were iron beams installed for one purpose, hanging prisoners until they suffocated to death. Unlike traditional executions where a sharp drop would break the neck instantly, these hangings were designed for maximum suffering. Prisoners weren't given a long rope. They were slowly strangled, with their feet barely touching the ground. Some kicked, struggled, and fought for minutes, their faces turning purple as their lungs begged for air. Others, exhausted and too weak to resist, simply went limp. Other executions were even more sadistic. During the winter months, when temperatures plunged below freezing, the SS decided to turn the weather into a weapon. Prisoners were taken to the edge of the camp where barrels of ice-cold water had been prepared. One by one, they were forced inside, held under until their bodies stopped struggling. The SS called it punishment, but there was nothing to punish. This was pure murder, disguised as discipline. Some prisoners became test subjects in horrific medical experiments carried out by SS doctors who saw them as nothing more than lab rats. Some were injected with deadly diseases just to see how long they would take to die. Others had their organs removed without anesthesia just to study the effects of pain and trauma. Some were sewn together, cut open, or given poison disguised as medicine, just so the Nazis could perfect their techniques for killing even faster. And those who survived the experiments were disposed of like garbage, dumped in mass graves, thrown into the ovens, or left to bleed out on the floor. By early 1945, Mauthausen had become a living nightmare, unlike anything before. Inside the barracks, some prisoners tried to hide under the piles of corpses, knowing that soon they would be next. Then on May 3rd, the SS began disappearing. One by one they fled. Some dropped their uniforms and blended into the towns nearby. Others set fire to documents, desperately trying to erase their crimes. On May 5, 1945, only a handful of guards remained. The prisoners knew something had changed. The air felt different. That morning they heard a sound they hadn't heard in years. Engines. Tanks. The United States Army had arrived. At 10 a.m., a patrol of the US 11th Armored Division reached the gates of Mauthausen. They expected resistance, but there was none. The remaining SS had already surrendered or fled. The prisoners, half dead, barely able to stand, stumbled forward, some crying, some simply staring in disbelief. One of them, weak but determined, climbed the main gate and hung a massive banner. It read, "The Spanish anti-fascists salute the forces of liberation." The war wasn't over yet, but for the starving, broken souls inside Mauthausen, it was finally over for them. For years, the prisoners had suffered every form of cruelty imaginable, and now, for the first time, the SS was powerless. The prisoners took revenge. When they found the remaining SS guards, they did not wait for trials. Some were beaten to death on the spot. Others were thrown into the crematorium, the same place where they had burned thousands of innocent men, women, and children. For the prisoners, it wasn't just revenge, it was justice. But for others, justice came in a different form. There was something Mauthausen had that few other camps did: proof. Throughout the war, the Nazis had destroyed most photographic evidence of their crime. But here in Mauthausen, a group of Spanish prisoners risked their lives to smuggle out what would become some of the most important images of the Holocaust. For months, they had worked inside the camp's photography lab, secretly hiding negatives of the horrors they had witnessed: executions, starvation, the gas chamber. If they were caught, they would have been killed instantly, but they weren't alone. A local woman, Anna Pointner, helped them. She took the negatives and buried them in her garden, hiding them until the war was over. When Mauthausen was liberated, the photos were dug up and revealed to the world, and when the post-war Nazi trials began, these images became undeniable proof of the crimes committed here. The photographs spoke for those who had died. They ensured that the world would never forget. The horrors that unfolded within its walls were so extreme that even today some people struggle to believe they actually happened. But they did. What would you say to someone who denies or minimizes the atrocities of Mauthausen? How can we, as individuals, ensure that these stories are never forgotten? Share your thoughts below, and let's work together to preserve history, honor the victims, and make sure the world never allows such evil to rise again.